I had never heard that so-called trans is misogyny. And I thought, what is that? She said, think about it, Kara. It's the ultimate penetration of our bodies by men.
And just calling them men made this group of lesbians just recoil.
People were basically harassing my boss. And my poor boss, she's in her late 60s. She's very old school.
There are these little micro cancellations happening all over America around this exact topic. Yours is a good example.
You know, for Matt Walsh to make the movie What is a Woman, I'm glad he did it.
Women seem to be much more complicit in going along with this crap than men.
These very wealthy men are colonizing sex to make it disappear.
And so they'll just call you transphobic and shut down the conversation completely.
California state law has the most batshit definition of the word sex that I've seen anywhere in the country.
All right. I'm with Kara Dansky, everybody. Welcome to Walk-Ins Welcome. So good to have you.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I really wanted to talk to you because I noticed that you wrote a book and it seems to have come true in this election cycle. Tell us about your book. Tell us about why you wrote it, and then I want to get into kind of how you're feeling now.
So I wrote one book called The Abolition of Sex: How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls in November 2021. And my point with that book was to sort of give mainstream Democrats, moderate leftists, vocabulary to use in talking about issues around sex and gender, in particular women's sex-based rights. And about a year and a half later, I was in touch with the publisher and I told him, I need to write another book because it's not working, right? The Democrats in power are not listening to ordinary rank and file Democrats. They're not listening to the feminists like me. I'm a lifelong registered Democrat. And I just told him they're not listening and I need to write another book. And it has to be about a reckoning, the reckoning that's coming in 2024 if they don't start listening to their own constituents. And so that was published in November 2023, 1 year ago.
Wow. And what was the like impetus to write your first book?
So I have been a TERF, if you like. We can break that down.
Break it down.
Break it down. Okay, so I started paying attention to all the ways in which so-called gender identity harms women and girls as a sex class in 2014, when a woman who's a radical feminist lesbian told me, she schooled me in it, and she said, everything about this is totally anti-woman, it's anti-feminist, and it's all grounded in misogyny. And I was like, whoa, that's interesting. I was sort of a good liberal. I spent nearly 20 years working in the criminal justice system in the fight to end mass incarceration. And I was kind of going along doing the good liberal things that all good liberals do. And I had never heard that so-called trans is misogyny. And I thought, what is that? And I asked her to elaborate. And she said, and I will never forget this, she said, think about it, Kara. It's the ultimate penetration of our bodies by men. And I was like, whoa. So I did my research and I figured out what she was talking about. And in 2015, I joined an organization called the Women's Liberation Front, or WOLF, which I know you've talked about in your podcast.
And
I joined. What was that?
And they've come on to the podcast.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I joined the organization in 2015. I joined the board in 2016. That organization sued the Obama administration in 2016 for redefining sex to include so-called gender identity under Title IX. As far as I know, that's the first time that happened, but it wouldn't be the last. And I stayed on the board of WOLF until 2020. And at around that time, Women's Declaration International, a global organization that fights to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls, was being launched. The US chapter launched sometime in summer of 2020. And I got more involved in that. And so in 2021, Women's Declaration International US chapter, which had a different name then, but anyway, it's WDI USA now, it incorporated and formed a board of directors. And I joined the board of directors, which elected me president. And I served in that capacity from 2021 until 2024. And at one point in early 2017, I went on Tucker Carlson, which was a very controversial thing for me to do because I'm a lifelong liberal and a radical feminist. And a lot of people got very angry at me for doing that. But I wanted to do it because I wanted people to understand that there is a left-leaning feminist critique of so-called gender identity. So I went on to be on his show on Fox before he lost his job there, I think a total of 9 times.
Wow.
And one of those times, the publisher caught the my attention, or I caught his attention, and he contacted me and he said, "Wow, you have a really interesting critique. I really want you to write this book." And so that was the impetus for the abolition of sex in 2021.
So, gosh, there's so much. Okay. Can you just define what TERF is for people who don't know what that term is and who aren't terminally online like we are?
Yeah. So at some point, and I don't know when, gender activists, I'll just call them, coined the term TERF to mean trans exclusionary radical feminists. And for many years, women who are considered TERFs just rejected the term and considered it a misogynistic slur. And that included me. I considered it a misogynistic slur for a long time. That is until October 2021, when Netflix released Dave Chappelle's special on Netflix called The Closer. And in
Mhm.
that special, he talked about J.K. Rowling, who's been very outspoken on this topic. He said it's quite reasonable for women not to want men in women's bathrooms. And he announced that he is on, quote, Team TERF. And at that point, I thought, okay, this term TERF now has some political salience, because we are leftists, we are radical feminists. We don't actually try to exclude all people who call themselves trans, because there are all sorts of women who call themselves trans who are always welcome in women only spaces. The group of people that we want to exclude from women only spaces, sports, prisons, etc., are men.
Right.
So, but in any event, by October 2021, I was like, all right, this term TERF has political salience. I'm just going to reclaim it for myself and I'm going to start calling myself a TERF. And
Mhm.
that's what I did.
So, it's funny because I've been doing this bit for online probably since I think the tweets go back to 2017, 2018, where I say patriarchy so crafty. And this was my first experience of being called a TERF because online I would see something like a male and woman's prison, just all of the examples of men encroaching in women's spaces. And I was like, the patriarchy is so crafty, they'll turn themselves into a woman and stay on top. Now, I've been trying to turn this into a stand-up bit, which is a much harder needle to thread, depending on the audience. And I do a show where it's all lesbians. It's run by a lesbian, and it's lesbians. Sometimes the lesbians are older and a little bit more based, as you would say, as the kids these days would say. But the other night, I bombed trying to do this bit just because I opened with, I was never really a feminist. This is like something that I was a feminist, but I was always like, it seems sketchy to me. Like guys don't have to open doors and they don't have to work. This seems like it benefits men in a lot of ways. And I was, a little skeptical of some of the waves of it. And then I saw men taking like women's places in sports, and just calling them men made this group of lesbians just recoil because they've been trained to be like, no, you can't call them men. That alone is an offense that's like just too far gone. And so then they were just not on board with me at all. And it's wild to me. It's wild to me that lesbians in particular, don't see how disruptive this has been to many of their communities in general, and like dating apps and all this stuff. So that's what like radicalized me over the years. And I too am like you, a very left-leaning person. There were many things that radicalized me to be like questioning of the left, but that I think was the biggest one. And you seem to be one of the people who rightfully identified this shift and then wrote about the reckoning. How was the response to your first book? And then, I mean, obviously that inspired to write your second book. How was the response to the second book?
So it was interesting because it came out in the fall of 2023 when a lot of things were happening and dominating the news cycle. So it didn't get the kind of publicity that I was hoping it would get. It's gotten around only through word of mouth. A lot of feminists in the UK have read it. Um, and so that's good. I would say in terms of publicity, it hasn't done nearly as well as I'd wanted. And in terms of actually accomplishing its mission of convincing the Democrats to knock it off already, it definitely didn't accomplish that mission at all either. But the mission was twofold. One, it was to convince the Democrats in power that they've got this issue totally wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew at the time that even if it didn't do that, that it provides a record of what they've done. Because what I worried about at the time and still worry about is that the Democrats in power are going to memory hole this. They're going to pretend like it didn't happen. They're going to pretend that they never supported men in women's sports. They're going to pretend that they never wanted to harm children with puberty blockers and opposite sex hormones. And I didn't want them to get away with that. And, remember, this is my party we're talking about. I still haven't left the Democratic Party,
Yeah.
even though plenty of people I know have done so over this issue. And as you say, over many other issues. I have chosen not to do that as hard as it has been. But in any event, I wanted to make the record so that they can't pretend that this never happened. So many women have been harmed by this already that even if they walk back their policies, they have to hold themselves accountable for what they've done to women and girls. And in that sense, I'm very proud of the book. And I think it's accomplished what I wanted it to accomplish.
So, can I ask a question? And you don't have to answer it because I realize this is very personal. If you are somebody in your place who hasn't left the Democrats, because I haven't given up on them, but I chose to vote against them for these exact reasons. How do you square voting for Kamala, who is part of undermining and totally eroding Title IX? I don't know if you did vote for her or not, but how do you square that? Are you still voting Democrat?
No, I
Okay.
didn't. So I had my absentee ballot sitting on my kitchen table for weeks leading up to the election. It was just sitting there. And,
Taunting you.
it was taunting me, right? And I was like, what am I going to do? Because I did not have it in me to vote for Donald Trump. I
I
didn't do it in
understand.
2016. I didn't do it in 2020. And I could not bring myself to do it this year, notwithstanding this issue. I just couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I couldn't vote for Harris either. Um, I very reluctantly voted for Biden Harris in 2020 because by 2020, um, backing up in 2016, I knew how devastating gender identity is for women and girls. As I mentioned, I figured that part out at the end of 2014. So I knew that. What I didn't know at the time was just how far Democrats were going to take this.
Right.
So I very enthusiastically voted for Hillary Clinton in the general in 2016. I don't want to get it. I don't want to relitigate with anyone the primary fight between Hillary and Bernie. That's old news. Regardless of how anyone voted in the primary, I very enthusiastically voted for her in the general because I just didn't know how far the Democrats were going to take this.
Yeah.
By 2020, I was so fed up with them. And I should also say, I've never liked Joe Biden. I've been angry at Joe Biden since Anita Hill testified against Clarence Thomas for his Supreme Court nomination. So I never wanted to vote for him at all anyway. But I especially didn't want to do it in 2020. But at the end of the day, I did. I ticked the box. I threw my ballot in the mail in advance and just washed my hands of it. But this year, I just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
I just could not do it. After 4 years of what the Biden-Harris administration has done to women and girls, nope, absolutely not. So I wrote in a candidate.
Okay. There was, I think, some sense of oh, Biden's going to be moderate. He's going to, bring the party back from the brink of this kind of these radical policies and lurching into this kind of madness. And that wasn't the case at all. It just went further and further. So I think a lot of people who felt maybe he was like the Democratic, that was part of the reason that I think he won the primary, was he was supposed to be the moderate influence. And I feel like I've heard from a lot of Democrats who were quite disappointed at how radical he was, particularly on areas like this. And I mean, I'm using he loosely. I don't know that this was him making these decisions or just a radical young staff who was pushing this all through.
I mean, I think most people have no idea, because how could you possibly know? Then Vice President Biden was saying, quote, transgender discrimination is the civil rights issue of our time in 2012. His record on this goes back to 2012.
Wow, okay.
And there's no reason for anyone to know that. I happen to know it because there's a Politico article from 2012 that talks about it. But I also happen to know that that was the same year that a guy named Tim McBride, whose name is now Sarah McBride, was the president of the student body at American University and announced that he's a woman named Sarah. And he's very, very good friends with the Biden family. He worked directly for Biden's older son, Beau, who tragically died, I think, in 2015 of a brain tumor. So we're not talking about Hunter here. It's a different son. But McBride worked for him directly. And there's this whole thing that happened around 2015, 2016. Back up. McBride also interned at the White House immediately upon graduating from college in the Obama-Biden White House. And then fast forward to 2015, 2016, you've got Jill Biden giving speeches at the Human Rights Campaign, talking about her very good friend, Sarah McBride. You've got President Biden mentioning Tim McBride in his interview with Dylan Mulvaney. I don't know if you know about Biden's interview with Dylan Mulvaney, but in any event, this is just to say that a man who calls himself a woman named Sarah, who is from Delaware and is now serving in Congress as of, starting in January. He was elected.
Oh, right. He was the one who won. Oh,
yeah.
That's the same person?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, I mean, I can understand why people would think that Biden has no idea, right? He struck us as a pretty moderate politician. And, we all know that he's got some cognitive things going on. So I can understand thinking that maybe he just doesn't know, and this is just some crazy thing being pushed by a staffer. But I just don't buy that, because I know too much about things he said and who he knows.
Okay. Well, that makes more sense. I think it would be easy for, I think the majority of people don't know any of this. They don't know. I mean, even I have a hard time articulating it, because I did a podcast with Winston Marshall recently, and he was asking me about this. And I said, Title IX, because I follow all of it closely. But when he asked me to break down when Title IX went into effect, why did it all of a sudden start encompassing like the Me Too stuff? How did it start encompassing the gender stuff? I was like, I'm not a lawyer, I mean, I have some idea of how this happened, but I'm not somebody, it was challenging for me to answer a lot of those questions without sounding like a moron.
Sure. I mean, it's totally understandable, because people don't know this. I mean, I do understand a lot of these things, in part because I am a lawyer, and in part because this is all I ever do anymore. In 2019, I basically turfed myself out of a career in criminal justice law and policy. And ever since then, this is all I do. So when someone asks me what I do, I say I'm a full-time unemployed TERF, which is true.
What does that mean, turfed yourself out of a career?
So my first lawyering job after clerking in federal court was as a public defender. And I did lots of things in the criminal justice arena. One of the things I did was work as a senior counsel on criminal justice policy at the ACLU from 2012 to 2014. And around 2015, I started doing consulting work, and I was working with various progressive criminal justice agencies on ending mass incarceration, ending police militarization, doing some stuff with drug policy. So from around 2015 to 2018, I was doing criminal justice stuff to pay the bills, while on the side, I was volunteering with Wolf and being very outspoken about women's rights. I ended up getting a job at a city agency in Washington, D.C. in 2018 and stayed in that job until the end of 2019. And the main reason I left is that over the course of 2019, people were basically harassing my boss. And my poor boss, she's in her late 60s. She's very old school. She doesn't understand social media. She's very offline, and she doesn't understand this issue at all. So people were like sending her email messages. One random person sent a tweet. I'll just say tweet and Twitter, even though we know those aren't words that we use anymore, but tweeted.
I'm not letting him trans that brand. I'm sorry.
Some random person tweeted at a member of the DC City Council, and the tweet contained a photo of me sitting on a panel that I had been sitting on talking about women's rights. And this person tweeted this DC City Council member and said, "Why is there a TERF on staff at that city agency?" And so the city council member got very angry, and he reamed out my boss in his office and told her to fix the problem. And she had no idea what was going on. She somehow thought that I had somehow brought women's rights advocacy into the work I was doing at the agency, which I hadn't at all. The panel I was on was during non-work hours. So she was totally confused. Understandably. And I kept my job. But over the course of 2019, she was just getting email message after email message complaining that there was a TERF at the agency. And every time that happened, she had to bring it to me. And then it just became a distraction from the work of the agency. And I was like, all right, I can either keep this job and shut up about the sex-based rights of women and girls, or I can quit. So I quit. And my last day at that job was at the end of 2019. So that's what I mean when I say I turfed myself out of a career. Because if you talk about these things in public, if you say that men aren't women, you're not allowed to have a job, basically.
Bananas! It makes,
Yeah.
I mean, this is why I've been screaming on my show, women, and we literally sold hoodies that just say women on them for 5 years. I've just been saying women because it is bonkers. You can't even use that word in certain spaces anymore. And this is even more insane because I'm a moron on YouTube who's just doing comedy. You actually are a lawyer who's trying to do criminal justice, and now you can't really practice because you believe that a man who puts, isn't a woman. Like that's wild to me. That's crazy. And this is what I meant when I said for years, I said, we don't hear about people like you. We hear about these big cancellations or somebody might get canceled, but I was like, there are these little micro cancellations happening all over America around this exact topic. Yours is a good example. But even like the people getting kicked out of mommy groups, I would hear from somebody, people would email me and say, well, I pushed back against a man on like an opposing team and all the moms kicked me out of the group. It is crazy. What has your experience been, so in your book, which I think really did, I think the numbers reflect that your warning should have been heeded, particularly with suburban moms, breaking for Trump. What are you hearing now? What are you hearing? Are you hearing stories from people about this? Or is there any momentum? Does it seem like the tide is turning?
So there are two Democratic congressmen, to the best of my knowledge, only two, who have said since the election, look, we need to talk about the issue of male athletes in women's sports. So that's good. As far as I know, they are the first and only Democratic officials at the federal level to take a stand. And at least one of them hasn't backed down. One of his staffers had a temper tantrum and walked out. And he's been called, the congressman has been called on to apologize. And he's like, no, I'm not apologizing. All I said is that we need to have a conversation. Americans clearly want to have this conversation. So I was very encouraged about that. Since the election, I have submitted 3 op-eds to various major papers, basically trying to have this conversation and saying, look, we need to talk about this. And one of them outright rejected me, and the other 2 simply ignored me. So I'm somewhat encouraged that at least 2 Democratic lawmakers have spoken up. And I'm discouraged that in the course of the past week and a half, I haven't been able to get into the media. One of the biggest problems with all of this is that the mainstream legacy media has been totally, totally complicit in being a mouthpiece for the Democratic Party's support for so-called gender identity. And they paint all opposition to it as being from, right-wing homophobic bigots. And I just know that they're lying because over the course of the past several years, I cannot tell you the number of op-eds and letters to the editor that I have submitted to the New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. And they just always go ignored, which is fine. I should say, major papers ignore letters to the editor all the time. They have no obligation to publish them. But I can't believe that they just don't know that there is a leftist radical feminist critique of gender identity in this country. And certainly it is undeniable now in light of the presidential election. As you say, so many suburban moms broke for him. I don't know how the media can ignore that.
Did you see the other day there was that guy, they were trying to have a panel, and I think it was CNN. I believe it could have been on MSNBC. And somebody brought it up and said, we've got the women, and he was like, I'm not going to have somebody threw this fit saying, I'm not going to hear transphobia on this panel. I won't be a part of it. And so they'll just call you transphobic and shut down the conversation completely. I had a friend who was tweeting about how he believes you'll start seeing them publishing these critiques and trying to give the Democratic Party an off-ramp because they need one. They have been all in on this and with the gender affirming care. So he believes you'll start seeing more pieces about the dangers of the sex, opposite sex drugs, the hormone replacement there, or whatever it is, the cross hormone drugs. And you'll start seeing them try and give them some kind of way to back out of this. But I haven't really seen it. And it doesn't sound like they're listening to you. What were you doing? Okay, a couple questions to back up. Who sends all these emails, like to when you were working on the council? Who is it? Activists?
I assume, but they're anonymous. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. So much of this gender activism comes from tech, and tech is not my strong suit, right? Like I can write a decent legal brief. I can write a good article or an op-ed, but tech, I have no clue. So people would just send these anonymous emails and she would have no idea who they're coming from. But yeah, they would just say things like, you need to fire her. She's a TERF. And my boss would just be like, who are you and what?
What's a TERF? Yeah.
Yeah.
I still have to remind, the boomers in my life who are liberals what TERF even means. They'll ask me, they don't know. It's like they need a glossary of terms when it comes to this stuff. They don't know. There's a whole language that's popped up around it. And it's, native to the younger generation, but certainly not to Gen X who aren't very online and older. And
yeah,
I think they just sense like there's a visceral reaction to not being able to say things like men and women are different or having that language policing or having to walk on eggshells. And even if people can't explain what or why, they're just like, no, no, I'm not going along with this. Even if they can't articulate what they're not going along with or why they're not going along with it, which is a lot of the older people that I've talked to.
And a lot of the older people will sort of, I think, make a concerted effort to go along with it. The, older liberals will want to go along with it, but then they'll try to use the language and they'll use the phrase transgender man to mean what they think of as a man.
Transgender woman.
Right, exactly.
Right.
But they don't
Because
understand.
it's confusing.
They don't understand that if you use the phrase transgender man, you're actually referring
to a woman,
to what the gender activists think of as a female person.
Right, right. It's intentionally confusing, though.
Yes.
So what were you doing in 2014 that you became aware of this?
I was just working in criminal justice. I was literally sitting in my living room. I was at the ACLU at the time. I had no idea at the time how all in the ACLU was. But I was sitting in my living room with my friend, and we were just talking about politics. We were just talking about race politics, class politics, sex politics. And I just mentioned something about transgender rights. I was never particularly a trans activist. I just went along because I thought that's what we were supposed to do as good liberals. And she just stopped me and she was like, nope, I've got to educate you on this topic. And she did.
Because I think the radical feminist critique of this precedes anything that came from the right. I see a lot of this online. You'll see the people being like, we owe this to Matt Walsh and all these people who have brought the conversation to the mainstream in a way that I don't think the radical feminists were doing. But to act like radical feminists and women weren't silenced and fighting this and in the trenches for like a decade plus before is also completely ridiculous, because most of the women I know have suffered a lot of, even yourself included. It seems like you're pretty well adjusted and you just made a choice. I feel like you weren't. I really identify with exactly the position that you found yourself in, because I found myself in a similar one where I looked at my cousin and said, I can shut up and not make these jokes and not say these things that I want to say, and we'll still work in Hollywood, or I can speak up and push back and make these obvious jokes at this low-hanging fruit insanity that's coming from our party, and we probably won't be working in Hollywood. And so it was a choice, but I mean, I got, unceremoniously let go from Playboy. It's hard when in my position being freelance, it's not like, and probably similar to you, you don't really know. It's like, you don't know why doors just won't open. And you don't know if it's because they're just not opening, like, oh, it's just an op-ed, people can say no to that, or if it's because you're touching some third rail and they don't want to be associated with it.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you navigate it? How do you not? Because I think I've seen it drive a lot of people insane and become quite paranoid. And I understand that. I understand how it's like, are they not responding to me because I'm an untouchable, or is it just because they're busy?
Right. I mean, it is hard. Before I got my law degree, I have a bachelor's degree in political science. And I am thinking pretty much constantly about what's going on with the political science aspects of this movement. And I have a Substack, and I often use my Substack just to sort of unload on what my thinking is. And at this point, I'm pretty sure the reason the major papers don't want to platform the radical feminist critique of so-called gender identities because they just don't want to hear it. And they don't want to acknowledge that they've been complicit in as I said, being the mouthpiece for the Democratic Party's support for this stuff. And just going back to what you said about the conservative men taking credit, yeah, it's really infuriating. And it's true what they say that radical, and as you said, that radical feminists have not gotten this before the mainstream. And that's partly because we don't have any money and we don't have a
Right.
platform.
Right.
So, like, for Matt Walsh to make the movie What is a Woman, I'm glad he did it. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad he did it. But, that's a Daily Wire publication with a lot of money and a lot of um, fancy production.
Yep.
And we just don't have that. So, yeah, it's quite annoying when the conservative men take credit for this when women have been doing this since forever. Since, I will say, 1979. Do you
Yeah.
know about what happened in 19? Okay, so you
No,
know about Janice.
I don't know.
So Professor Janice Raymond, who is a lesbian radical feminist, she published a book in 1979 called The Transsexual Empire. And it's all about how this is ultimately going to be the undoing of women's rights. And she
Wow.
republished it in 1994
Can
with
you
a
still get
newly
it?
written, what?
Can you still get it?
It's available online
Oh,
as a
okay.
PDF.
Oh, okay.
Everyone can download it for free.
The Transsexual Empire by Janice, you said?
Yep.
What's
Raymond.
Raymond? Okay.
And so she republished it in 1994, and she wrote a new introduction to the 1994 edition. And the introduction says, hey, everyone, look out for this word transgender. It's coming, and it's going to confuse everyone, and it's going to entrench sex stereotypes in society. And she said this is terrible for women and girls, 1994.
Wow.
So, yeah, feminists have been at this for a while.
And did she get canceled or anything? Or she just wrote it and was like, whatever, bye?
She has tenured professor status
Okay.
at the University of Massachusetts. And I think in 1994, you could probably get away with that and fly under the radar.
Yeah.
But by the same token, by flying under the radar, it didn't get mainstream attention.
Right. I mean, that is the thing. Like, I'm glad that I also think, and I don't like it. I don't like to say these things, but I do think a couple things. Women seem to be much more complicit in going along with this crap than men. So I do think it's good that a man or men brought this to the attention of men, which brought it to the attention of the mainstream, because places like YouTube and Twitter and politics are generally more male dominated. They just are. Even YouTube, when you look at the numbers, it's just men are spending more time just ingesting this stuff, and they spend more time talking about it. And it's just a fact. Women are watching true crime. I had the funniest conversation with a woman on a plane, and she told me she's like, "Oh, you have a podcast? What's it about?" And she was like, "Oh, I just really like true crime." And I asked her why. I was like, "Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. That's most women." And I said, "Why do you think women really like true crime more than men?" And she said, "Because the men are busy murdering." I was like, it's the funniest answer from this old lady. I was laughing so hard. I think about her all the time. But so I think there's that. It's good. It's part of the reason it brought it mainstream, is that there is that. And I also just think women go along with this crap more. They're the ones who are kind of allowing it. I get outraged all the time about the fact that now you're seeing teenage girls have to literally not compete against a team and forfeit their game or their season or whatever else they're forfeiting, and in order to stand up to this, because none of the adults are doing it. This is crazy to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people don't know this, but first of all, kudos to those young women who are boycotting and forfeiting their games. They absolutely should not have to do that. This is going to impact their careers, and it should not be on them to have to do this. But,
No.
mad props to them for doing it. And a lot of people will say, well, why did the Penn women's swim team, why did they stand for allowing Leah, Will, Thomas to compete on their team? Well, the answer to that is that back then in 2021, all those young women, they're in college, right? And they've been indoctrinated in this crap. And if they expressed any discomfort with Thomas being in the pool or in the locker room, they were told they had a mental health problem and they needed to seek therapy. They were just completely
Gaslit.
psychologically abused
Yeah.
and gaslit by their own university administrators.
We had Paula Scanlon on the
Awesome.
podcast, and she
Yeah.
also made this really great point about how, because of where it fell. So they were worried about it. They thought the adults would surely come to their senses, and then the season was canceled and Leo was supposed to graduate. So they didn't think that it would be a big thing. They took a gap year or something and then came back after not being able to swim. And they were so grateful to be back. They would tell them, oh, you're just lucky you don't have to wear your masks in the pool. This is something that people said to them, that they just also kind of forced them to accept Leah on the team because Leah took this gap year and then came back. So they thought that they would just graduate and then it wouldn't be an issue, but they decided to take a gap year and then come back and compete. And so it's like shady thing after shady thing after shady thing. And then, like you said, these poor girls were, but she made this point that they used the pandemic on top of just telling them that they had a mental illness for even questioning why Leah Thomas was in the locker room. They also used the pandemic to make them just, so grateful to even be allowed to swim. Fucking crazy.
Yeah, it's awful. On the topic of women supporting this, that's such an important topic, right? Because you're absolutely right. So many women seem to be actively championing a cause that actively undermines their own interests as women. That is absolutely true. And I guess I just want to say that at its core, this whole thing, this whole denial that sex is real, this whole denial that women and men have different kinds of bodies is very much a top-down, male-driven thing. There's billions of dollars behind it. There are very rich men who are benefiting financially from it. And there are some really creepy fetishistic men who have a lot of power and a lot of money who are driving it. So I think it's important to put the onus on the very wealthy fetishistic men who are driving this whole thing, while at the same time acknowledging that on the ground at the grassroots level, it is unquestionably mostly women who are championing it for sure. And in the professions.
Can you name names of these powerful men who are doing this and behind this?
Yeah, so the one guy is named Martin Rothblatt.
I knew that would have been my first guess.
He was born Martin. He's got, I don't know, at least millions of dollars, if not billions.
No, billions for sure.
And he has been platformed by MSNBC, by Oprah Winfrey. He's been on the cover of New York Magazine. So he's behind a large part of it. And he runs this company called Terasem, Terasem. If anybody wants to look it up, it's all right out there. And, again, sometimes when I talk about this stuff, I realize I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's not a conspiracy. He says it right out loud. And if he were just some weirdo saying weird things in his mom's basement, I'd be like, okay, weirdo, whatever. But he's not. He's very wealthy and very powerful. So that's one. Another guy is called Tim Gill. He runs something called the Gill Foundation, which is based in Colorado. And another one is John Stryker, who founded the Arcus Foundation that funds a ton of so-called queer and trans movements and projects all over the country. And John Stryker is an heir to a medical supply company called Stryker Medical, I think. But his name is John Stryker, and he founded this thing called the Arcus Foundation with the express purpose of funding these so-called queer and trans projects. So those are
Okay.
three big ones. And then, of course, there's Jennifer Pritzker, who was born James and is related to the governor of Illinois and to the former Secretary of Commerce under President Obama, Penny Pritzker. And I think Wikipedia describes him as the first openly transgender billionaire in America.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he's ex-military. He calls himself Jennifer.
Okay. Yeah.
So those are a few.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's like a very so the Rothblatt thing's interesting because there's a very, and again, I sound like a whack job whenever I talk to my friends about this, but there is didn't he write a like weird thing about transhumanism? He has a whole, because there's this theory that the transgender movement is really just a step to getting to transhumanism. If you can just swap genders, it makes it that much easier for people to be like, well, you can just swap out an arm for a cyber arm and for all what are your thoughts on this as just being a stepping stone to some kind of transhumanism?
That's definitely what Rothblatt thinks it is.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, he wrote a book, as you say. His book is called From Transgender to Transhuman. He's not quiet about this. This is absolutely what he thinks. He thinks he's going to turn us all into cloud people, basically, that we're all going to exist in the cloud and we're not going to have any need for human bodies. And that's partly why they're going after women. In the words of Jennifer Billick, who you may know, she founded the 11th Hour blog, they're colonizing our sex. These very wealthy men are colonizing sex to make it disappear. And then there's a lot more to say about relationships between trans and the surrogacy market, between trans and the fertility market. I mean, there's a lot going on there, and I'm not the expert in that stuff, and we probably don't have time to get into it, but it's worth looking into if you want to check out the 11th Hour blog.
The 11th Hour blog. I should have her on the podcast. Yeah, there's so much to this that's really interesting. And again, I run into like horseshoe theory stuff where it's on the left, this radical transhuman, like you said, trans surrogacy, trans fertility. And then on the right, I like to notice a lot of, when I go to conference, I just like to notice what I'm hearing a lot about in tech in general. And there's so much about embryos and about the population collapse and all. I'm like, I don't know, guys. All of this is so kind of, there's something slightly unsettling about all of it, where it meets in the middle of women and women being either erased or, like you said, kind of colonized. It's I really never thought twice about surrogacy, and I still have kind of complicated, I'm not sure where I land feelings on it, but until I had a child and saw how much she needed me, her mother, in the aftermath of being born. And then I was like, whoa, wait, what? So I suddenly was like, are we taking the kid into consideration in this arrangement? I'm not
Totally.
sure, but people are like, no, they've done lots of studies and it doesn't matter. And I don't know. I'm still not sure about any of it. We live in like such very strange times. And then if you even push back against some of the more obvious stuff, like the men and women's prisons, which this is something that I don't understand. How is this not a left-wing fight that they're fighting?
It's so interesting because I mentioned that I worked at the ACLU. Technically, I worked for the New York headquarters, but I was physically based in the DC office because that's where I lived. And I was a couple floors beneath the ACLU's National Prison Project. So the ACLU's National Prison Project is a prisoners' rights organization, right? They They fight for prisoners' 8th and 14th Amendment rights, among other things. But they're at their core, they're a prisoners' rights group. And they had this project, which I assume they still have, which is a movement to end the practice of shackling pregnant female inmates. So
Mm-hmm.
prisons will do this, right? Like a woman will be in prison, and if she's going into labor, they will literally shackle her
Mm-hmm.
during childbirth. I do not have children. I have never given birth to a child. But from, you might have opinions about that. And from women I've spoken to who have given birth, that just sounds like torture.
It is. I mean, it's so inhumane. I don't even know how it's legal at all.
So the ACLU has been fighting back against it, arguing that female inmates have international human rights and that shackling pregnant women during childbirth is a violation of their not only international human rights, but also the Constitution. And that's
Mm-hmm.
always their argument. And they're never confused about what they mean by female prisoners, right? Like they know what
Yeah.
a woman is when it comes to doing things like that. Um, but yeah, no, and now, as you probably know, the ACLU has intervened in the California case that I know you've talked about on your podcast, where Women's Liberation Front has sued the California Department of Rehabilitation, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, over the state law that allows male prisoners to be housed in the women's prison. And the ACLU has literally now intervened on behalf of 3 or 4, I think it's 4, but it may only be 3 male inmates for their alleged right to be in the women's prison. So, I mean, yes, I agree with you. This absolutely should be something for the left to fight back about, but it's the left pushing it.
That's so weird to me. I don't understand. I don't know. I mean, are they I guess it is like one of those things where I have I had Blair White on the podcast, and it's like, would I want Blair to go into Gen Pop with a bunch of men? Probably not. But like, should there be a separate place then?
Yeah, I mean, so here's the thing that comes up frequently. If Blair were to be incarcerated, yeah, I mean, I would be fine with Blair being in a separate third place, but nobody on the other side of this debate is ever okay with that.
Right.
Women, feminists have been saying for years that, okay, just create a third bathroom, create a third sports category, just stay out of the women's. And that's never considered to be acceptable.
Why
They
is that?
always they always demand the women's.
Yeah. I mean, I made a joke long ago. I think it was probably 2019 when I started Dumpster Fire, and people are like, "You're always covering this topic. This is like, I'm getting sick of you covering this topic." I'm like, I don't want to cover this topic, but I was like, we are, a couple news cycles away from suck my dick bigot, but we're long past that. That already happened. Like, I think that was 2020. People were
Right.
literally standing with signs saying that. And you're considered, I mean, I wrote this whole piece for Unheard about how corrosive this is to women, because I grew up in the gift of fear time where it was like you didn't question that instinct. You were taught, if you get on an elevator and a guy gets on an elevator, you get off. You listen to that little voice. You don't second guess it. And now women are told, if there's a guy in the women's room and they feel unsettled or unsafe, that they're going, oh, that's just me being a trans. Like, what? This is insane. It's so dangerous for women.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have to psychologically get past that, right? So like I was in a women's bathroom at a restaurant one time, washing my hands, and this dude walked in, and he probably had a few too many. And as soon as he saw me, he turned bright red and he turned and walked away, right? Like
Right.
that guy had made an honest mistake. I'm not mad at that guy. It was,
Right.
he just got in the wrong one. Fine. But any man who wants to be in a women's bathroom, locker room, changing room, spa, prison, whatever, is violating women's boundaries and should be seen as inherently suspect. I don't care whether that man calls himself a man or whether he calls himself a woman. Either way, any sort of intentional invasion by men into women's spaces uh, is suspect and probably ought to be seen as criminal. And we used to know that, right? We used to know that. But today, the instant a man says he's a woman, we just hold the doors open and let him walk right in.
I still like I've done so many podcasts talking to people about this. I've spoken to, and I don't understand how it happened, and I don't know how to undo it. I feel like maybe there is a tide turning, but I think that, and then I'm like, no. Then I get kind of demoralized and think maybe not.
I think it all happened in stealth,
Mm.
right? Like until I told you that President Obama tried to redefine sex to include so-called gender identity under Title IX all the way back in 2016. Did you know that?
No, I
Yeah.
did
I
not
mean,
know
how
that.
would you? Most people have no idea that President Biden was wandering around talking about transgender rights being the civil rights issue of our time in 2012. Like, how could you possibly know that? So,
Hmm.
all of this came in really stealthily. California state law, it has a public accommodations law. This is how the We Spa case happened. Are you familiar with We
Oh
Spa?
yeah,
I'm sure you are.
yeah.
So,
So for
so
people
that
who
was
don't know, just explain it quickly.
Okay, so this is a spa in Los Angeles, a very traditional Korean spa where nudity is expected, and where nudity is expected, they separate by sex. So naked men over here, naked women over here. In the place where people are expected to have clothes on, it's fine to be mixed sex. So this man just wanders into the women's section of the nude spa with an erection in front of women and girls, and the women were horrified. And the spa basically said they couldn't do anything about it. And they were right. The spa was right because California state law has you you're fine with swears on
Oh
your
yeah,
podcast.
yeah,
California state law has the most batshit definition of the word sex that I've seen anywhere in the country. It's California Civil Code Section 51, if anyone wants to look it up. But it is absolutely insane. And it basically says that any man can have access to any female only space if he calls himself a woman or if he says he has a gender identity. And so people were very angry at the spa for letting this man be naked with his erect penis in the naked women section of the spa, and I get why, but the spa wasn't wrong. They were following the law. So
yeah.
is it so anyway, so I forget why I brought that up, but I guess just to say that state laws on this are really nuts, and California is probably the worst. So, I mean, that's really the place to go. Go to your state legislatures and say, we don't want this. There's a similar case that happened outside Seattle. This is an all female only spa called Olympus Spa. And by practice, it's all female. Again, traditional Korean spa, nudity is expected. And a man demanded membership and they said no. And so he sued them. And so that case is ongoing. And Women's Declaration International USA submitted a friend of the court brief in the case, and I was the author of that brief. And so to do that, I had to look up Washington state law on public accommodations, and it's almost as batshit as California's. So this is what we're dealing with.
Yeah. I mean, this was like the whole thing up in Canada where he was suing the spa because they wouldn't wax his balls or whatever. And I think the spa ended up winning, right? And he had to, which was surprising in Canada because Canada seems quite lost to me on this topic in particular. They're really, which weirdly enough, I think like Rothblatt has a company up there too. I feel like I went down some rabbit hole one night where I was like, oh, you have a science company up there or something? I don't know. Maybe it
You could
was,
be right. I don't know about that either.
I don't know. I have to double check. I could be just making things up and was in some fever dream. But I feel like I read something about that because they don't have like quite the same bioethics, rules that we have. So there's a lot of stuff going on in Canada around everything. Yeah, I don't know. This is where, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have a piece that literally just dropped online right now, I think, as we're podcasting, and it's all about really how the Democrats Bud Lighted their brand. And it is this issue among many other things, but also just weirdly erasing men out of there, not talking to men at all either. And at the same time, like normie men. So it's a very strange dynamic at play, and I'm not sure how it all kind of resolves. I'm hoping there's so much money in like the gender affirming care and the surgeries. That's why I feel like I think Europe and the UK seem to be a little more ahead on us of this, but they also have socialized healthcare, so there's an incentive to kind of actually follow the science and do what's right for the general population. But here, it's just it would be like a crazy money grab.
Totally. But there's a case coming before the Supreme Court very soon where these issues will be front and center before the Supreme Court. That'll be a good thing, I think.
Which case is it?
It's called United States versus Scrimetti. So that'll be before the Supreme Court for oral arguments on December 4th. And, those of us who have been in the trenches of TERFing for all this time, we're not going to stop. And so I don't know how much longer we're going to talk, but there's some noise happening in my apartment, which is why I say that. We're just going to keep going. We're just going to keep fighting this, and people will get angry at me because sometimes when I think it's a good idea to do it, I'm not going to stop doing that. We're just going to keep fighting, and we're going to keep fighting for women and girls as a sex class. And as you say, this affects men too. And as a feminist, my primary concern is for women and girls. But absolutely, I wrote The Abolition of Sex because I'm gravely concerned if our society continues to deny that sex is real, that's going to have massive impacts that I don't think people have really thought through.
Yep. What's your biggest defect of character? We'll wrap it up with my last two questions.
My biggest defect of character is that I am naively optimistic almost always to a fault. But if I weren't, I wouldn't be able to keep doing this. I would have just thrown in the towel a long time ago.
And go on.
No, I am naively optimistic to a fault.
Yeah, that seems like you would need that. What's your biggest asset? I mean, I guess that would be an asset too.
Yeah, how about that? Can I say that too?
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of people, it's it's often a double-edged sword. Like the thing that is our biggest weakness is also what makes us strong and brave and able to go on. Wow. Well, I'm grateful for your books. You really, I want everybody to go read them. And I think, are they selling? Like, are people finding them now?
Yeah, they're selling steadily. They haven't made like blockbuster sales by any means. So please go buy the books.
Yeah.
But they're selling steadily. And, obviously after the election, there was a spike in sales for The Reckoning.
Okay, great. Well, where can we find you and your Substack?
Yep, please check me out on Twitter @KDansky and on Facebook @KDansky and karadansky.substack.com, where I write a Substack called The TERF Report.
I love it. Thank you so much for your work and for your time.
Thank you, Bridget. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you out there in the TERF wars on the front lines.
The check-in with Bridget and Cousin Maggie can now be found at Phetasy.com. It's been titled Another Round with Bridget Phetasy, and it's now in video.
This has been Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you're welcome. It's the dumbest line.